So with that, it is my honor to reintroduce Brian, who I have shared before, but is a partner at the Kurtz Group, as well as my co-founder and dear friend of Nova Impact, Olivia Dell. She works as one of the investors at Falcon as well, where she sources deals, builds data-driven analytical frameworks, develops strategy for portfolio companies, does crazy things with me like summits and random Instagram takeovers for Giving Tuesday. But most importantly, she's between her and Brian really leading the way in terms of passion for impact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. But I also just wanted to share being able to host things like this with friends like Olivia and Brian, and getting to see old and new friends like Vanessa and Justine and Rajiv and Paul. It's really great to be able to have this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderators, Olivia Dell and Brian Kurtz, for this next session, who will introduce our panelists. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. And this panel, this segment is called New Year, New Logic, Honing New Strategies for Climate Justice. And we're here for about 40 minutes with some really brilliant visionary leaders to figure out how we can logic our way out of the climate emergency that we're facing and the resulting climate justice inequities. Every year that passes, we find ourselves in the later innings of this game, inching towards disaster. Accelerating climate action is one thread that pulls this whole group together, and I would go so far to call them climate superheroes. Olivia, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here and so excited to have this incredible panel. I think we wanted to create this panel because in the past 2 years, as we have gone through a global pandemic and are still in the midst of it, we've seen a lot of demand for social justice initiatives and also climate initiatives. And so we wanted to bring together these incredible superstars in the climate space and the social activist space to kind of give some insights into their experience and maybe share a look into the crystal ball and in terms of what lies ahead for climate justice and what we can expect in the years forward and how we can be supportive of those initiatives. We have a short amount of time and a lot of star power here on this panel, so we want to move through pretty quickly to allow time for each of our panelists, but we're so thrilled to have you all, and thank you so much for joining us.
So our first question, just in 2 minutes, if you could each please introduce yourself, perhaps starting with you, Raj. Your work, what personally fuels your passion for this topic, climate justice?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Brian, and to the team, and also Delma and others who have, I think, also framed the conversation beautifully. I am Rajiv Joshi. I am an economist, activist, and entrepreneur. I have just finished publishing a report on what we call the decisive decade that was commissioned by Cristiana Figueres, the chief architect of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I am here because I believe that the only way to halve global emissions by 2030, which we must do, the science requires it, is to recognize that it must be a fair and a fast transition. And if we're going to get there, we've got to start thinking about questions of equity. How do we create the new social contract? How do we ensure that it's a just transition? And navigating that transition is going to be one of the greatest challenges that we faced. And it's going to require revolutions in every sector, every industry, across generations, across geographies, and across worldviews. And I'm hopeful that in this conversation, we can start just to unpack what some of those issues might be and how we can kind of muster the logic that we need as a species to figure out this massive endemic issue in this coming decade.
That's great. Brian, I think you're muted, but I'm Vanessa Feigenstern, and I'm the executive director of Bank Forward and an investor with something called Investable Oceans. It's wonderful to be here with a panel of some of my favorite people and thinkers in the world. I really appreciate the framing for today because I think I came to the climate issue and the climate justice issue in particular as many people do, through the heart, so to speak. I grew up working and visiting indigenous communities in the Brazilian Amazon, given research that my parents used to do as anthropologists, and was very aware as a result of the impact on frontline communities of climate change, deforestation, and other types of ecological degradation. And today, much of my climate journey has been about applying increasing logic and systems approaches to addressing and providing solutions for the issues I first started to care about because of such an emotional attachment and firsthand experience of the negative impacts I was seeing. So Logic Day is a wonderful way to celebrate how we merge the heart and the cerebral processing of these issues. Thank you. I'll pass the mic to Justine.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thank you all for having me. It's so great to see you, Brian, Olivia, and this wonderful group of panelists. My name is Justine Lucas. I'm the executive director of the Clara Lionel Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization founded about 10 years ago by Rihanna. She named it after her grandparents, which I always like to share because it's just a wonderful way to highlight her, as it's evidence of her humble nature and the connection to her roots. Our work is focused on both climate resilience and climate justice in the US and Caribbean, given our founder's roots in Barbados. I've been an activist and worked on justice issues my whole career, whether on justice for survivors of domestic violence or human rights in Cameroon, to now our work on climate justice at CLF. It's just something I've always been passionate about. So I'm excited that this is the topic of today's conversation. And CLF moved into this space actually from a racial justice perspective. Issues of equity and human rights are fundamental to our founders' beliefs. And in 2020, we were able to mobilize approximately $11 million for racial justice, for the movement, the divestment from policing, criminal justice reform, all in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And then we went on a journey of diving deeper with our partners and coming to understand that climate justice was a priority for many of them. And then through our work in the Caribbean on climate resilience, we came to know some amazing community organizers in the climate justice space. And last year, through a strategic planning process, we focused our racial justice work on climate justice. And we have an exciting year of work ahead in this space. And really, thank you again for having me. I'm just really excited to be a part of the conversation.
So great to have you here, all of you. And Paul, I see your camera just dropped, but if your audio is still here, would you like to introduce yourself? And
yeah,
what was your passion for this topic, climate justice?
Yeah, my name is Paul Watson, and I'm a venture partner with Climate Impact Capital. Move ahead, see my virtual office. Great to be a part of the panel. I got involved in I'd say climate change and climate issues when I was in the 3rd grade, and I wrote a report on acid rain, and it really moved me along a lot. And I don't know how at that age I got interested in it. Someone was telling me about why these forests in Canada had no animals, and I was a big animal lover. I grew up surrounded by nature and a lot of love, and I think nature spoke to me early on. My grandmother spoke to her plants, and everybody thought she was cuckoo, and I thought she was cool as shit. So it was it really impacted me early on, and then that kind of progressed me into my vocation. I started in chemical engineering, ended up moving more into a business vocation. Spent a lot of time overseas looking at different areas, mostly of Asia, with India and China, 2 key spots, and looking at a lot of a range of issues. And a few years ago, I was able to join forces with a guy who ran Shell Technology Ventures, who was very frustrated with the slow pace at which oil and gas companies were moving away or decarbonizing, and then really mitigating some of the problems that might or might not have been caused by them. So I had a unique opportunity to work across a range of different financial areas, and I saw a lack of inequity in lending in the U.S. And so this continues to be an area for me in terms of not only diversity and equity, but also access to solutions in terms of food, in terms of energy access. We see a big disproportionate distribution, I would say, of access to renewable energy in the US. So that's kind of what I'm focused on right now. How do we bring equity to people that have less than a 660 or a 700 FICO and don't make $100,000? So just very basic stuff. They might be on a fixed income, but it really stemmed from my focus on the environment and how do we make these incremental changes and switch from old sources of electric generation to a more sustainable ecosystem. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. We've got a diverse group of people. I'm obviously focused on impact investing, so energy, food, and water. Energy is our focus right now because that's what people really care about. So really excited to be a part of this panel and hope to contribute something to move the cause and the mission forward.
I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, it sounds like everybody's work here has really focused around climate, not for the sake of climate, but rather because you see the interconnectedness of all of these different issues and how climate interacts with issues of social justice and access, and access to clean water and kind of just the basic things that we often take for granted. So very excited to have you all here. Moving into our next question, we would love to learn more about the specific initiatives that you're working on in the year ahead. We know that you all work on so many incredible things, but what's next? What can we look forward to? How can we be supportive, etc.? I'm going to start with Vanessa.
Thank you, Olivia. Bank Forward is an initiative that is focused on working with the major banks, which give $1 and $10 on average to fossil fuel companies in some sort of financing. And it's focused on mobilizing clients of all kinds to petition their banks and demonstrate consumer demand for much more aggressive and ambitious climate policies, primarily to stop financing new fossil fuel projects. One of the ways in which banks talk about their climate policies is by making net zero commitments, which has been a trend that has grown dramatically over the last year. And we've heard a great deal about it from Stefan in the last panel and some of his work with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, et cetera, and some of the outcomes from the last UN climate conference, COP26. These commitments are really important, but it's really important to think about how the accounting and the math and the reporting happens going forward. And we will be very focused on that. From a climate justice perspective, we are particularly focused on how banks in particular count offsets as part of their equation, because offsets are a way for net zero calculations to show that you offset one emission by planting a tree, for example, and therefore they can write that emission off of their balance sheet. However, it doesn't mean that they are actually reducing emissions. It means that there is a coal plant spewing pollution somewhere in the world, and the people who live around that coal plant are still going to feel the effects of that air pollution. It is not solving the problem for that community. It is simply trying to reduce the math and reduce to some extent the impact of that emission on the overall climate. But there are still negative effects that are not being addressed. So a lot of Bank Forward's work on the metric side will be to raise awareness and try to limit the use of offsets and have them approved only for uses when there is no ability to reduce absolute emissions. So I'd like everybody here to think about when they look at commitments from banks about net zero or about reductions and interim targets. This all gets pretty wonky, but you'll hear more and more about it. Please check to see if they are committing to reducing the absolute volume of their emissions. There are lots of ways they'll say they'll reduce the intensity of emissions or they'll reduce in certain sectors, but if their overall volume is not reducing and in fact growing, their climate justice policies are not improving and there are still negative impacts they are not addressing.
Raj, can we hear from you next?
Absolutely. And Vanessa makes a number of critical points. I mean, corporate accountability and how we account for this transition is absolutely one of the most critical issues that came out of COP26. We have so many commitments and pledges, but so many of those that don't get met, and we cannot let that continue. For Bridging Ventures, we're really a theory of change, which recognizes that in order to make this transition between the world that we have right now and the world we now need to build quite rapidly, we need to work together and bring together activists and artists and investors and educators and business leaders to help address issues that we can't address alone. And we've been applying that theory of change in various settings, whether it's corporate accountability, for climate justice, or whether it's looking at the issue of, and I might raise this as a good example, of small island developing states, which are feeling the brunt of the climate crisis, many of whom are the least responsible for what we're seeing in the world, but who are going to really, in this next decade and as we move forward, really see significant impacts. And I did spend a few months during the pandemic in the Caribbean basin to see how the interconnectedness of both the COVID-19 pandemic was in a way accentuating this crisis. And but at the same time, that in many ways, that region provides us with hope. I spent time with fishing communities, for example, who were using ecosystem-based adaptation to support the development and the regeneration of the marine protected areas in and around the island communities, to provide sustainable livelihoods for people who, while they were also the ones who were responsible for providing the majority of the nutrition, because of the fact that food supply chains had been disrupted so significantly by the pandemic. And so for me, I think there's an opportunity to create a partnership facility to try and scale up some of these examples, to look at regions like Barbados, like Jamaica, where you've got significant cultural potential for inspiration in the world, but at the same time, an opportunity to support economic growth and development that is sustainable. That is an example of this narrative that we put out called the Great Regeneration, which is really about post this pandemic, how do we ensure that the world really does recover and that we create a new development model, which in a way scales the examples of what people like Delma and others are kind of pioneering in our economy. But that is at the same time a multi-stakeholder, public-private, people-oriented approach to partnership development, which recognizes that we can no longer just have this resistance where we, on one hand, are throwing the stones, and on the other hand, not putting people at the table together to figure out how do we find a common ground to move forward. And I think this is really about building common ground. How do we create that common ground to come up with systemic solutions which recognize that every single sector has a role to play, whether it's a fishing community, or whether it's schools, or whether it's international capital that is being mobilized to the tune of $130 trillion in an alliance, but which people on the ground are not still seeing the seeds of. And so for me, this is a year of delivery, and we have to move from talk to action on the climate agenda and figure out how do we do it in a way that advances equitable climate solutions. And perhaps my biggest dream in a way is that the climate justice agenda also opens the door to healing and reparation of some of the endemic intergenerational injustice that we really need to look at as a society, from the era of colonialism, of slavery, of many of the crimes against humanity, which continue to hold us back and which are under the surface in some of these discussions and negotiations. But if we can find a way forward through the climate agenda, then perhaps we can create the truth and reconciliation that is needed across humanity to then start scaling up some of the solutions that will really help us move to a higher degree of logic.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that plays on perfectly with the work that you're doing, Justine. So do you want to share your answer now?
Absolutely, Raj, you almost took some of my talking points. Yeah, it's really wonderful to hear that you're focused on small island developing states and taking a look at the Caribbean, because that really is the focus of our work. And I think, as you said so well, these climate disasters, they're not impacting communities equally. And that really is, the heart of the why of why we're doing the work that we're doing. They're impacting communities of color and island nations. They're facing the brunt, but they also are not carrying responsibility for the climate crisis. So with that in mind, our work is focused in two core areas. Our climate resilience initiative is working towards a goal of the Caribbean becoming a climate resilient zone. So across the Caribbean, in some of the most marginalized communities, we're hardening and equipping with renewable energy, health clinics, schools, shelters, looking at communications mechanisms to ensure that communities have access to these critical facilities before, during, and after natural disasters. So they're able to move through. They're not, there isn't any kind of reliance on outside aid, which generally never reaches the communities that need it most. We're trying to flip that whole emergency response model on its head. And we currently have projects in Barbados, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Belize, Trinidad, and others, adding new countries year on year, really proving this model of climate resilience. I think, as Vanessa was saying, there's a lot of talk that happened at COP26, and there were some important commitments that were made. Climate resilience and adaptation is something that seems like a hot topic, but not a lot of philanthropy or investment is going into that space. So we're really trying to prove that model. And then additionally, because we really believe strongly, funders must build partnerships with grassroots organizations and really just acknowledge their deep understanding of what's necessary to achieve climate justice. In their own communities, we're investing directly in grassroots organizations and movement leaders. And we're doing that both in the US and the Caribbean, leaders that are really championing climate justice. And we have a big announcement in this space actually next week. So I encourage you to keep an eye on what we're up to. We have a grant round that'll be supporting entities focused and led by women, youth, people of color, Indigenous communities, even LGBTQIA communities. The announcements will touch all 50 states and 7 countries in the Caribbean. So we're excited to share more with you soon.
Finally, Paul, do you want to step in?
Yeah, let me unmute real quick. Really great points, and really love the kind of the diverse focus. We started on a global focus on the energy transition. Largely, we focus on impact investing for energy, food, and water. And our group is a little bit different in that we are a bunch, mostly engineers, that have taken a systems dynamics approach for really focusing on scope 1 emissions. I know there's a lot of talk around the different emissions. We have scope 1, which is direct emissions, scope 2 and scope 3 moves further out. But what we've really spent a lot of time is working with the major corporations and OEMs, trying to funnel money into projects that make a positive impact on the energy transition. Largely, that is decentralizing electric grids, creating microgrids, and stuff that Raj and Justine, you're spot on, and definitely would love to collaborate more, because this is an observation we saw almost 2 decades ago on creating these sustainable nodes. The problem is, and I think many people experience this when they deal with a range of stakeholders, is that we are dealing with a very difficult monopoly right now with utilities. For example, I'm based in Austin, Texas. I'm dealing with Pedernales, a 400,000 member co-op that just put a solar tax on us and said, if you want to decarbonize and do something good for the environment, by the way, you're going to pay 30 to 40% more. So a lot of our challenges are dealing with this traditional mindset and teaching people that there are logical ways to decarbonize. There is technology out there, and in fact, there's ways to manage loads with cool home energy management systems. Now, we are very focused on Texas right now, but a lot of our partners have been global. We have focused on Asia, specifically China did a lot of big moves about 10 years ago. I was extremely proud of some of their moves. We understand that there are a lot of areas of inequality and justice that need to be brought to that country. But in terms of the focus that climate impact has is really accelerating new technology and adopting and integrating the existing technology that's out there that we know that really leads us towards a path of I don't even know if this is a word, but I use it a lot, less carboniferous generation, but also a better understanding of what I saw when I was based in China. In 2009, I was looking at the US and I was appalled by how much per capita we consume. So a lot of what I'd like to move into towards the end of this year and next year is really gamifying that experience. Take this transition, what we see with Facebook and the metaverse, and how do we incentivize people across the board to reduce their consumption, be that energy, be that water. Myself, sometimes I leave the water running, but whenever I lived in India and China, I became very aware of leaving the water running is not the thing that I would want to do. Or if I was on an island, obviously the water would become an issue. So how do we access these areas that don't have the capital, ways and means, or even the access to that technology? And hopefully this is what we'll be working on with the Department of Energy, is really bringing these opportunities to these low income areas where they can access these off the shelf technologies, and then really start to gamify the experience in this, let's just call it this metaverse environment, to where we can incentivize everybody, including the family, to understand what their impact is. And I think that's a really big part of what we're dealing with our current focus on Texas as a pilot, and then in the US, but with the shared learnings of the islands and globally. So very much the energy transition and really taking these feedback loops to understand how these incremental changes can change consumer behaviors is one of my personal focuses.
Yeah, that's a great segue, actually, Paul, into the next question. As change makers, we often encounter and have to work through resistance to change. And you work with institutions in the energy sector and OEMs. And Vanessa, I know you work with a lot of institutions in the finance sector, but really resistance can come from sometimes even the most unlikely, surprising places. So a question for you all is, in your work, where have you encountered resistance to change or a lack of logic? And what techniques have you learned to work around it? Vanessa or Justine, would you like to chime in first?
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Okay, I'll chime in. I think there are a couple of ways. There's both the question of where are we encountering resistance, and I can name a couple of areas in that realm. But I also always like to make the point about where there tends to be a failure of logic, and it's not always where the resistance is. Say you are a foundation or a company or a wealthy family, very wealthy family that has $100 million in assets, and you allocate 1% to philanthropy per year, which is above average, and say that is entirely focused on climate philanthropy. And then you have 20% of your portfolio in impact investing, which is about average. That means you have $79 million in your bank account that is being administered more or less as the bank sees fit. So 1 million to climate, about 20 million, to impact investing. And then you're going to have 1 out of every $10 of your remainder go to fossil fuels, which means that 7.9 million are being allocated to fossil fuels, which is almost 8 times what you are allocating to climate philanthropy. And in that way, it sort of disabuses us of the logic we tell ourselves, which is, if we are not doing active harm that we are consciously driving, we are doing no harm. And I think that's the biggest sort of mind shift that I want to introduce today on World Logic Day, which is that we have to be doing proactive good and be accountable, that saying do no harm is no longer an acceptable strategy on climate. And in that vein, that sort of carries over to all of the areas where you might find resistance. There's just a lack of understanding because these issues become so complicated in the financial world, and so few people know what their pensions are doing or their insurance companies are doing. And that's not by accident. It's meant to be obscured so that it is harder for people and stakeholders to share their voice, but there are more and more mechanisms for doing that. And I encourage everyone to go to one of our partner organizations, bank.green, which will indicate where your bank falls on the list of fossil fuel financiers, depending on what country you're based in. So I'll stop there because I know others have many important things to say, but think about that as on this World Logic Day. Justine.
Vanessa, thank you for sharing that data. That when you break it down like that, it's so powerful. Thank you for that. And thanks, Brian, for the question. I feel like I know it's World Logic Day, but it's also like, I love the question of resistance and thinking about where there are areas of tension. And the two things that come to mind, one is inspired by Paul. And I would say, something that's important to us, and the reason that we started including renewable energy on all of our projects is there isn't often an equity lens placed on the renewable energy transition, particularly in a place like Caribbean where, electricity costs are already so high and there is a major wealth gap, and wealthy individuals are equipping their homes with renewables, and then it's driving up the electricity costs for the rest of the folks on each island. And so, for us, being able to equip critical facilities that communities rely on with renewable energy is one small step that we can take in sort of pushing forward this narrative of the need for equity and thinking about that transition. But to me, it seems obvious, but I think it's one point I wanted to make. And the other that comes to mind is just the importance of funding locally in emergency response to natural disasters. Again, this seems obvious. There's a long, long history of what's happening in the emergency response space. It's obvious that communities know what they need best, particularly in emergency situations. They know what they need best in time. And unfortunately, there are so many international organizations that continue to play a role and a heavy hand in that space. And the most recent disaster in the Caribbean that was at a large scale was really the earthquake in Haiti. And we were able to fund 8 Haitian-led community-based organizations in the aftermath of the earthquake. And I was so surprised by the reaction that we got. We had the US government reaching out to us, being like, how did you do that? It is possible to vet these organizations, to invest in these organizations in a quick, timely manner so that they can help support their communities in a time of crisis. But unfortunately, the media continues to encourage support of international organizations. And with Haiti, it's a country that has a devastating relationship with international philanthropy. So I just think it's a really strong example of the need to fund locally, particularly in emergency response situations. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be logically what folks are doing. So I thought I'd share that one.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Paul, do you want to step in as our final panelist?
Yeah, just listening to this, it makes my mind race on so many different areas to go. But, one of the real big lack of areas of logic or failure of logic is, I think, a stakeholder problem with the utilities. Let's just focus on that one, in that most of these people are trying to keep their jobs and pension. And as we saw with the CEO of Dannon, who got ousted by activist shareholders, a lot of these problems are very difficult when we're driven by earnings per share. So a lot of what we're trying to do is make these incremental changes and bring transparency to consumers, but also to, I'll point out ExxonMobil. They raised $100 million fund, and they must have spent $20 million on marketing that green fund that they raised. And so in fact, I checked my bank just now. Randolph Books, my credit union's doing good, but all these other banks, and I think how do we drive transparency into what the real issues are at the same time that we're dealing with the stakeholders? And what I found with this local utility that Olivia is definitely familiar with is consistency. We just got to keep at it. People's attention span changes day by day, and it's just being consistent and things like this. And soon this resonance will come to the top. And especially with this failure of logic, I think at the end of the day, we get into these mindsets to where we see the logic, but we also have family that we need to take care of, and we have stakeholders within our own household that we are often limited by what decisions that we have made. And I really love what Vanessa, Justine, Olivia, and Raj are doing, because it's like with the lending right now. If we didn't have predatory lending out there, from payday loans to some of these dealer platforms that charge up to 20 or 30% for a solar loan, there would be no solution. So how do we drive towards solutions that are accessible by consumers? Because until those solutions are there, we will continue to have the lack of channels for financing. So one of the other areas that I'm really looking at are these areas of critical infrastructure. So how do we make military bases understand, or help them to understand, that these are critical loads and there are existing solutions out there? So we're going to continue to focus on the renewable energy piece, and hopefully the food and water really do come in. And I think the failure of logic will come with this right here, continuing to keep things like this going. And like what we've seen, we've spent 18 months with this local co-op. How do we continue to recruit more like-minded people for the cause, that take their eyes out of the earnings per share and these stakeholder challenges, and really drive towards the actual solution? And I think the islands, I think these areas, I'm particularly focused on Mexico right now. I was sitting on in the Riviera Maya, and I laughed because I was on the ocean and I was looking at this transformer arcing in front of me and thinking, why in the hell do they not have solar, but they have a distribution grid with a line that's right in between me and a hurricane that could be blown right into the building? So stakeholder education is going to take an army, and I really appreciate being part of this this action oriented and impact focused army and hope, mission with the team on the call today. So thank you.
Another great segue for us, Paul. You just keep feeding it to us. We want to assure that this conversation doesn't stop here, and we want to build the supportive ecosystem to support initiatives like all of yours to continue scaling. And so our final question, unfortunately, because we're out of time, although we'd love to buy more, because we could probably talk for days about this. And also, it's great to see all the amazing overlaps between panelists and the great work that's being done. The question is, how can we as a collective audience support your initiatives in the year ahead? Raj, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think it's worth looking at the Decisive Decade inquiry, because I think a number of the answers lie in there. But the research that we did at Oxford, what it found was that we need to start investing in highlighting and creating positive examples that can provide hope to people as to what the path forward looks like. We need to orchestrate and network and connect those examples so that they can be scaled up. And then we need to build the capacity of organizations in different regions of the world that can then operationalize that in places where it's not yet been done. And that creates a virtuous loop of ambition. And so I think that's part of what needs to be done. But I also think we need to think about how we, the means and ends question, really. It's like where we're going is as important as how we get there. And when you look at the renewable energy transition, for example, and this is something I did when I was for 7 years leading the B team together with Richard Branson and a number of global business leaders, we're looking at, what is the role of business in some of these questions? And if you look at electric batteries, for example, the the deep sea mining that's going on off the coast of Tonga and the Cook Islands and the impact it's having on local communities. This question of, what if 100 years from now we have this massive revolution in our industry, but actually it looks quite like the Industrial Revolution that we've had before, and human rights are undermined and gender equity is undermined, and we actually have a much more unequal world. We won't have accomplished the opportunity that lies ahead of us. And so I think the biggest opportunity right now is to think about how do we make sure it really is a just transition, and that the solutions, there is some filtration mechanism for whether or not we're taking lithium out of the Atacama Desert in Chile or destroying the ecosystems at the same time, or whether we're looking at solutions that do create that win-win, which is what we urgently need. And that requires corporate accountability, it requires radical collaboration across sectors, and it requires catalytic capital. And so for me, I think it's about finding those who are willing to put catalytic capital into some of these initiatives to support SIDS, to support loss and damage. Scotland, where I'm on the Just Transition Commission, has been one of the only governments at COP that actually puts some money into loss and damage. How do we actually start scaling these examples up and create the fraternity between countries and peoples around the world to start shining a light for the way forward?
Justine?
Thanks, Raj. That was really wonderful. I think, in terms of ways you can support Clara Lionel Foundation, we generally aren't asking for funding for ourselves, but on our social media, we lift up all of the organizations we partner with. So I'd say following us on social, we give actions that you can take in terms of like policy and advocacy actions you can take in the climate resilience, climate justice space. And I think so all the points that were made on this panel, looking at our own behavior, I think is one thing that we can be doing in particular. So I guess I would leave the panel by just saying, I think we need to all be listening and learning. And hopefully, I hope for a world where climate resilience and climate justice is getting increased funding and attention. But I think we have to start with ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justine. Vanessa.
I'd like to make a plug for a collective action that Bank Forward is working on with several partners in advance of April 20th, which is Earth Day, and also several weeks before shareholder season begins for the world's largest banks. We are asking people to align their money and their financial partnership decisions and where they do their banking in particular with their climate values. And after 2 years of really trying to work with the largest banks to accelerate meaningful climate action, we are now saying that it may be time to have a large movement away from certain banks that are entrenched in unsustainable policies and in fact increasing their unsustainable actions. And we will have a large day to announce movement of capital and opening of accounts in the banks that we consider most aligned with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree pathway. We are not a financial advisor as Bank Forward, but some of the banks that we have seen make commitments that are really admirable, include Amalgamated Bank, Beneficial State Bank, Triodos Bank, which is in the UK, in the Netherlands, Aspiration Bank Online, which is doing a good job. First Republic is the largest bank to have banned all lending for fossil fuels just last month, and we are supportive of the continued progress we hope to be seeing from them, as well as Banque Postale. Very happy to take more questions about that if you email vanessa@bankforward.org. I'll put my email in the chat. We hope you'll join us on Earth Day in making a statement about how you want to do business with your financial institutions and consider opening an account and moving away from bad climate actors. Thanks.
Love it, Vanessa. Paul, how about you? How can we support you in the year ahead?
Everyone really is already, and I think to the extent that logic doesn't work, shaming is a really good methodology. And I think if we can bring more details and data around why the old method is not working, and more data points around these banks, exactly, and around who's funding what, and around that it's not just what you're touching right now in terms of scope 1 emissions, it is scope 2 and 3 and your entire ecosystem and supply chain. And that's what we really need. We really need to go at these stakeholders at the local level. And as we found out, it takes a lot to get through the noise in social media. So as we go forward, we have not done it. We specifically cannot mention a lot of stuff that we do on our website, but as we start coming out, I will definitely keep all of you in our list as we can start to share some information. But think more of how I can support your initiatives and what I can say. And so reach out to me, Paul at Climate Impact Capital. I'm here to support your cause. If you're ever in Texas and want to go after some of the local challenges that we're dealing with here, come on down to Texas, y'all.
Awesome. And to all the panelists, we encourage you to use the chat as a way to connect with the audience and place your emails and place your links and calls to action. Olivia, will you bring us home?
Yes, I would love to. This has been such an incredible panel. And I think what's really unique about this group of people is that, we're seeing individuals who are working within larger organizations to kind of shift the paradigm on what it means to make logical decisions, right? So instead of going with kind of these legacy frameworks for decision making where you're not really incentivized to build sustainable development, to build equitable systems, and to build sustainable systems, rather, you have people who are working to bring equity and inclusion and sustainability into the realm of decision making processes. And it's, as you can see, it's leading to much better decision making. So, we're just so honored to have all of you here. We want to be supportive of the work that you do from a logic tree perspective, from a Nova Impact perspective, and then from a Kurtz group perspective. So please continue to engage with us, continue to do the work that you're doing, and please let us know how we can be supportive of you in the future. I'll kick it back to Brian or Chelsea.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, Olivia, Brian, for moderating this panel, to Raj, to Paul, to Justine, to Vanessa, new friends and old friends. Thank you so much for being willing to speak about climate justice, resilience. There were some incredible themes and ideas around how we make decisions moving forward. We're going to jump into our next panel now. I think we have all the panelists for this next session. So goodbye for now. I hope you'll stick around for some of the sessions. So this next session is going to be run by another Nova partner, James Lane Post, and dear friend of Olivia and myself, Christine. So we're really excited to have Christine and James Lane Post that'll help kind of lead this next panel session on the role of women in logic, media, and fashion. So with that, we're going to transition over to this next session. And I hope you guys enjoy this conversation around communications and logic.